All right, so a few months ago, a friend that I made in Prague messaged me after noticing that I had moved my travels over to Southeast Asia. And I told him that I'm enjoying my time traveling around Southeast Asia so much more than I ever did in Europe. And naturally, he asked me why. Like, what do I prefer about traveling around Southeast Asia? So, Brady, if you're watching, here's my answer. So at this point, I've been around both Europe and Southeast Asia long enough that I think I can give a pretty good comparison from a long-term traveler's perspective. Now, on the surface, this might sound like kind of a weird comparison to make. Why am I comparing Europe, an entire continent, to one little region of Asia? Well, when you count up the populations of these places, they're actually kind of similar in size. So Southeast Asia, just by itself, only has about 10% fewer people than the entirety of Europe. Southeast Asia might physically be quite a bit smaller, but it's way more dense. There's way more people in a much smaller space. So I actually think it does make a lot of sense to do this comparison. Now, when I compare two places that each have hundreds of millions of people, I'm obviously going to be making some pretty huge generalizations. So this is just my attempt to average out my personal experiences across both of these regions. So obviously there will be plenty of exceptions to everything I say, so just keep that in mind. So let's get right into it. Here are a bunch of things that I really love about traveling around Southeast Asia compared to Europe. And buckle up because there's quite a few of them. So the first thing I love about Southeast Asia is just how easy it is to meet other long-term travelers. It feels like everywhere you go, there's just so many backpackers, taking a gap year, or people traveling for 6 months in between jobs, that kind of thing. And it's so much fun to meet people like this and swap travel stories and share recommendations. Like, it feels like one giant community. Now, you can certainly find something like this in Europe if you try. Like, there definitely are places where people are living this more nomadic lifestyle, especially if you stay in hostels all the time. Like, you're gonna meet plenty of like-minded travelers. But if you're like Lexi and me and you're not living the typical backpacker life, I found that it's much harder to meet these types of people in Europe. You have to put a lot more effort into it. And we really didn't meet that many long-term travelers in Europe. Whenever we'd meet someone on a tour or on a train or whatever, it was almost always just someone on like a 2-week vacation, or maybe someone traveling around for a month at most. And all of these are perfectly great people, but there's just so much less to connect about compared to people who are traveling around for months or years like we are. Now, in Southeast Asia, we also haven't really been putting ourselves in a position to meet people like us, but it just seems to happen anyway. Like, just going about our lives and doing kind of similar things to what we did in Europe, we've just been meeting so many more long-term travelers all over the place. Like, I'd go as far as to say that almost every foreigner we met in Southeast Asia is traveling for at least 4 to 6 months, sometimes much longer than that. Like, it's very rare that we meet anyone who's traveling for a shorter period of time than that. And I'm not even that social. Like, I'm extremely introverted. I don't really go up to people and talk to them. I have a lot of social anxiety, but here in Southeast Asia, despite that, I'm still able to meet so many long-term travelers everywhere I go with basically zero effort on my part. And I don't know, like, that just makes traveling around this region so much more fun. Another thing I love about Southeast Asia is just how easy it is to have an amazing time and see everything we want to see with very minimal planning. So in certain parts of Europe, I found that it was more difficult to live in the moment because we had to keep thinking about what we're going to do later that week. Want to go on a tour somewhere? Well, we got to book that a few days in advance. Or want to see one of the big attractions? Well, we got to buy a ticket for a specific time, things like that. Now, for a vacation, fine, I can plan 2 weeks worth of stuff, but we've been traveling for over a year now, and planning just kind of gets exhausting after a while. So in Europe, at the extreme end, you have a place like Paris. So last year we went to Paris for about a week, and we had a list of things we wanted to see. And it was constantly like, well, this thing is sold out for the next 2 days, so we have a ticket for 11 a.m. on Tuesday, and then this thing, we have a ticket for 3 p.m. on Wednesday. And then the experience becomes less about enjoying the city and more about just getting to a specific place at a specific time. And this wasn't even in the heavy tourist season. This was late November in the off season. Now, of course, not everywhere in Europe is quite like Paris. That's kind of the extreme end. But it did feel like most places we went, we had to do some bit of planning, especially when it came to tours and stuff like that. And in Southeast Asia, like that hasn't really been the case. Here in Southeast Asia, everything feels so much more go with the flow. Like outside of Singapore, I don't think we've bought a single timed entry ticket anywhere, but yet we're still able to see everything we want to see. We can basically just walk up to anything we want to see and just buy a ticket right there, walk right in. And going on last minute day tours and excursions is also really easy. So in basically any city, we can just walk around and find tons and tons of tour companies, travel companies selling tours, and it makes it really easy to, talk to them about the tours, ask questions, and negotiate the prices against each other. Whereas in Europe, it seems like a lot of this industry has moved online. And while that's great in a lot of ways, and it's especially great if you're planning a vacation, it made us feel like we always needed to book things a few days in advance so they wouldn't book up. Whereas in Southeast Asia, everything just feels so much more spontaneous. Like whenever we've tried to book something, 3 days in advance, they'd just be like, we're not doing that, like come see me the night before. All right, let's talk about the cities. Southeast Asian cities feel so much different than European cities. And I'm not just talking about this little island I'm on, I'm talking about actual cities. A lot of European cities, especially the older ones, feel like they tend to value the preservation of their past above basically everything else. I don't know if that's actually the case, but that's kind of the impression I get as a visitor. So, you'll have the most centrally located part of the city, and that'll be the old town where you haven't been able to build anything for hundreds of years. And this is cool for a short visit or for history lovers, but it's not real. It feels like they're taking the most convenient part of the city and trying to preserve a world that doesn't exist anymore. So then the city center just turns into a tourist zone, and it ends up feeling more like a museum than an actual city. Now, of course, there are modern parts in European cities, but those tend to be more on the outskirts. Like if you look at the areas with, the denser areas with lots of skyscrapers where you can have lots of people living and working, it seems like they kind of push those off to the edge of the city. And this just feels so backwards to me. It's like so impractical. It feels like European cities prioritize the preservation of their history far above the needs of their present day population. And while European cities kind of feel like stepping back in time, Southeast Asian cities feel more like a glimpse into the future. And I like that. It feels more real. The denser areas are closer to the center, which makes things more convenient for the modern day population. There are certainly historical neighborhoods that you can visit, but that's not the priority. The priority is making a good place for people to actually live. And I think that's why everything is so much more convenient in Asian cities. When it's 1 a.m. and I realize I'm out of toothpaste, I don't care that there are 3 historic buildings on my street. I just want to be able to walk to 7-Eleven. And the convenience store culture in Southeast Asia is so great. It's so easy to get anything you want at any time of the day. So just in Bangkok alone, there are about 5,000 7-Elevens. That are open 24/7. And that's just 7-Eleven. That's not to mention all of the other convenience store chains. Now let's compare that to some places in Europe. So where we stayed in Naples, Italy, everything in the neighborhood shut down from like 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. So like all the shops, all the restaurants, like everything closed. So you have like a 4 to 5 hour period in the afternoon where nothing is open because it's apparently too hot to work in the afternoon. Now, closing anything for half the afternoon would be unheard of in Southeast Asia. Like the technology to deal with heat has been around for almost 100 years, and here they actually use it. Which brings me to my next point, air conditioning. Here in Southeast Asia, air conditioning is everywhere, and it's glorious. Now I get that a lot of Europe doesn't get hot enough to need air conditioning, but a lot of parts do get pretty hot, and For whatever reason, Europeans can't seem to accept the fact that when it's hot out, life is so much better with air conditioning. Now, when visiting a new place in both Europe and Asia, a lot of the big attractions are religious sites. So in Europe, you have a lot of churches, and some of them are magnificent. Some of them have incredible architecture and just are incredible places to visit. But I'd say 90% of the churches I go to, I just come out thinking like, yeah, that was just another gray building. But here in Southeast Asia, I find the religious sites to be so much more colorful and visually striking. You just have so many beautiful temples and mosques. And the temples especially are just absolutely incredible. There are so many dragons and other types of imagery that I love looking at. And many of them aren't even just a building, they're like an entire complex. Here's one I want to show for a second. This is Kek Lok Si in Georgetown, Malaysia, and it's an absolute spectacle. Like, it's such a visual treat, especially at night in February when it's all lit up for Chinese New Year. This place is just absolutely incredible. And I've even been to the Vatican. Like, I've been to St. Peter's Basilica, which is the most famous Catholic church in the world. And honestly, I think this temple in Malaysia that I had never even heard of was a more memorable experience. And this kind of extends across the board. Like, if you were to send me to a random church in Europe and a random temple in Southeast Asia, I'm probably going to enjoy visiting the temple a whole lot more. Now, I am conscious of the fact that these places were built for worship, not for tourism. So just simply talking about what these places look like without talking about the religious meaning behind them kind of defeats the purpose of why they were built in the first place. But let's be real, a lot of religious sites have kind of morphed into tourist attractions. When you have a price list and a ticket office and you're selling audio guides and you're sending tour groups through there, like, it's not solely a place of worship anymore. So I actually do think it makes sense to talk about these from a tourism perspective. Now, this is probably a good time to point out once again that these are just my opinions. This whole video is just my opinions and my preferences. For example, I grew up Catholic. I grew up going to Catholic churches all the time. So for me, going to anything that's not a church is going to be way more exciting. For someone who grew up differently, they'll probably have very different opinions, and that's totally fair. All right, next we have food. This one I feel really strongly about. I just like the food here in Southeast Asia so much more. Like, the way the sauces and the spices are used, I just think is so much better than European food. Like, it's so much more flavorful. Now, there is some food I miss in Europe, like the pizza in Naples, Italy, amazing. But in general, I find European food to just kind of be more bland. Whereas here, like in Southeast Asia, in any country, I feel like on any random street corner, the food you get is just incredible, especially as you get out of the more touristy areas. And I need to stop myself here because I feel like I could easily just go on for 20 minutes about how great the food is here. But this basically happens in every video. So if you want to see my thoughts on Southeast Asian food, just go watch one of my previous videos. Here's one that's sort of related. Let's talk about water. You know, that thing we constantly need to survive. Why do I have to pay for water in most restaurants in Europe? Like, in most of Europe, you have safe, drinkable running water. So why is my only option paying a few euros to get it in some fancy glass bottle that I don't need? Like, as an American, this is absolutely insane to me that any restaurant would not give you free water. Now, here's the funny thing. In Southeast Asia, in most countries, the water isn't even drinkable, yet you can still get safe, drinkable water for free in tons of restaurants. There'll often be a jug of water in the corner, or a pitcher, or something where you can help yourself to commercially produced drinkable water for free. And same thing with tea. Maybe a little less common than water, but many restaurants in some countries will give you unlimited tea for free. Sometimes it's even iced tea that's super refreshing on a hot day. Like, it's great. And speaking of restaurants, the experience of eating out here is so much better. Like, the hospitality culture in Southeast Asia is a completely different world compared to Europe. In Europe, I find the average day-to-day dining experience to be kind of frustrating. Like for anything fancier than a fast food place, I feel like I've wasted so much time just waiting for someone to give me a menu, or waiting for someone to take my order, or waiting to pay. That's the most frustrating one. Sometimes I feel like I have to put in a ton of effort just to find someone so they can take my money so I can leave. And half the time that's like at an almost empty restaurant. Like I kind of get the sense that nobody actually wants to work there. Like it often feels like the server didn't want to show up that day. So then they act like they're doing you a favor by giving you something you need. And obviously this isn't the case for everyone, but I have encountered enough slow or grumpy servers that this is just kind of the general feeling I get. But in Southeast Asia, it seems like people really take pride in offering great service. Like it really feels like people genuinely want you to have a great experience when you're in their establishment, all the way from the most casual places to the most high end. Now I've read that providing great hospitality is ingrained in the culture here, and I gotta say, you can really feel it, and it makes such a big difference. And it's not just with restaurant workers. We've noticed this with hotel staff as well, and with tour guides, especially tour guides. We've been on enough tours in both Europe and Southeast Asia to notice quite a significant trend. Now, I'm mostly talking about day tours here, where a guide takes a group of people around for like 8 hours and shows you all over an area. And we've done a whole bunch of these in Europe, and they've all been kind of boring. Like it just feels like it's always like someone going, here's a place, here's a fact about that place. Okay, now here's another place. Okay, here's another fact about that place. It just feels like everyone's reading a script. But in Southeast Asia, we've done just as many day tours, and they're so much fun. Like every guide we've had is funny, they're engaging. They're not just a walking encyclopedia. Like it feels like they're genuinely trying to make sure you're having the best day ever. And again, I think this is part of the culture. They're not just showing up to do some job they don't want to do. Like they want to make sure you have the best possible experience in their country. And this extends outside of a professional context as well. Like I just find the people in Southeast Asia to be friendlier across the board. Now, obviously you have friendly people everywhere, and we have met some wonderful Europeans, but on the whole, when you average everything out, I just think the average Southeast Asian is just so much more warm, so much more welcoming than the average European. Now, don't take any of this as fact. I know there's already probably tons of comments about how something I said doesn't apply to some place, and yes, that's true. Of course, there are lots of exceptions. Singapore, for example, when I talk about Southeast Asia, I feel like I should just remove Singapore from the conversation. Like, yes, it's physically in Southeast Asia, but it feels so much different than the rest of the region. Now, I know I've been praising Southeast Asia for this whole video, and that's because I really, really do love it here. But it's not for everyone. I'm sure a lot of people would come here and hate it. So in fairness, I just want to talk about some of the things that I don't really like about this region. So first we have the currencies. Every country in Southeast Asia has a different currency, which makes sense, but they have wildly different conversions. So at the time I wrote this script, $1 US was a little under 5 Malaysian ringgit, which is about 36 Thai baht, which is about 16,000 Indonesian rupiah, which is a little over 25,000 Vietnamese dong. And that's just a few of them. Now, you can get used to this if you're staying in one country for a while, but if you're constantly hopping around countries, it can get really hard to internalize how much things actually cost in your local currency without pulling out a calculator all the time. You're also gonna have to deal with physical cash a lot more as a foreigner. Like I can't pay with my Visa card nearly as much as I could in Europe. And even at places like hotels, like it's not uncommon that we have to carry around like literally millions of rupiah or dong or something to pay for some of our hotel stays. Now, a lot of the cash-only places actually do let the locals pay electronically by scanning a QR code with their phones and then doing a direct bank transfer. But that doesn't work as a tourist. That only works if you have a local bank account, which you're not going to have as a foreigner. And yes, Europe also has a whole bunch of different currencies, but they're all pretty close to each other, with some exceptions like Hungary. Like usually you're going to have to divide by like 5 or 10 to get the price in euros. You know, you're never dividing by 25,000 to get the price in euros. And 20 of the countries in Europe have standardized on the euro, which just makes things so much more convenient when you're traveling from country to country. Next, we have sidewalks. Sidewalks are definitely a lot better in Europe. In Southeast Asia, half the time it just feels like the sidewalk is essentially motorbike parking, or you'll have stores just spilling out onto the sidewalk, or maybe there won't even be a sidewalk to begin with. I generally prefer walking to get places, and half the time I feel like I have to walk in the street because either the sidewalk is totally unusable or there's no sidewalk to begin with. So yeah, Europe definitely wins in terms of walkability, and I do miss that quite a bit. Same with public transit. Some cities in Southeast Asia do actually have pretty good public transit, but a lot of them are kind of a pain to get around. And I do like how European cities tend to prioritize this a lot more. Let's talk about the heat. It can get really hot and humid in Southeast Asia. So it's actually not too bad where I am right now on the island of Gilead in Indonesia. But if you watch any of my previous videos that I filmed in Thailand or Malaysia, just watch how sweaty I get throughout the course of those videos, especially in the summer. Sometimes you walk outside and it just hits you right away. And I don't mind this too much anymore. Like I've kind of gotten used to it, but it definitely took a while to get used to. And there definitely are times where I wish I was in a more moderate climate. Now, like I said, most of this video is just opinions, but one thing I'd say is objectively worse is the tap water. So in most Southeast Asian countries, the tap water is not safe to drink. Like, it's just not something you do. And I do really miss being able to just take any cup or bottle and fill it from any sink I can find. Now, Lexi did find a way to get around this, and for Christmas, her mom got us these water bottles with a filter inside. So we carried these bottles around everywhere, and we actually can drink the tap water because there's a filter inside the bottle. But this is just an annoying workaround for a problem that doesn't really exist in most of Europe. And finally, we have the language barrier. Now, this one really varies by country. So for example, Malaysia, no problem, great English. Same with the Philippines, from what I've heard. But in general, I'd say it's easier to find English speakers in Europe than it is in Southeast Asia. Now, this isn't me trying to say that everyone should speak the same language I speak, but it is easier to connect with people when they speak the same language as you. And like it or not, English generally is the way people communicate with each other when they don't share the same native language. English-speaking places do make it easier for people all over the world to connect with each other. And Europe is generally a more English-speaking region than Southeast Asia. And then, of course, there are all of the other issues that I don't really notice day to day as a traveler. So this video is just my personal perspective as someone who's admittedly in a very privileged position. But there are lots of other issues in this region that affect the local population way more than they affect travelers. You know, there's all kinds of economic disparities and political instability and corruption and environmental issues and a whole bunch of other things. I can't confidently speak about any of these issues, but I just want to point out that this video does paint a rosier picture of the region than how much of the local population might experience it. So that's it. And I should probably point out at this point that I actually do really love traveling around Europe as well. I've spent about 6 months of my life in Europe across 15 different countries, and I've always had such a great time there. But personally, I feel like Southeast Asia has really captured my heart in a way that I can't really say about Europe. Like there are places in Europe that I love. There are certainly places that I'd love to return to, but as a whole, I think Southeast Asia is just more of a place for me. It's a place where I really just want to spend much more of my time. And I'm curious what you all think. I know there's a million different opinions about this, and that's great. So let me know in the comments where you prefer traveling and why. Also, I mentioned earlier how much I love Southeast Asian food, so go check out this video if you want to see more about that. And I will see you in the next one. Also, a little addendum here. I tried to plan the walking speed for this video to get a sunset in the background behind me. Totally failed at that, totally messed up the timing, but I do just want to show some of the pretty colors behind me. This is the island of Gili Air in Indonesia, and this place is amazing. I freaking love it here.